Have you ever noticed something strange? The moment you learn the story behind the distillery, the whiskey suddenly tastes different. Not because the liquid changed, but because your perception did. A bottle that once felt ordinary suddenly feels rare, intentional, even emotional. And that's the secret many drinkers overlook. Some of the most interesting spirits in the world aren't the famous ones. They're the hidden bottles, sitting quietly on shelves, waiting for someone curious enough to discover them. Tonight, we're exploring scout spirits, lesser-known bottles that become extraordinary once you understand the history of the distillery behind them. Because sometimes, the real flavor of a spirit is the story inside the bottle. Most people buy spirits based on labels, hype, or price tags, but seasoned drinkers eventually discover something different. The most memorable bottles often come from distilleries with fascinating histories, small operations, forgotten brands, or producers that survived incredible challenges. These are what many collectors call scout spirits. They aren't always the most famous, but once you learn where they come from, they suddenly feel far more meaningful to drink. And today, we're looking at a few examples where distillery history completely transforms the experience in your glass. Here's the problem most drinkers run into, and it's surprisingly common. Most people experience spirits only at the surface level. They pour the glass, smell the aromas, take a sip, maybe notice hints of caramel, vanilla, smoke, or spice, and that's where the experience ends. But when you only focus on the flavor, you miss something far more powerful: the story behind the bottle. Every distillery has a history. Some survived Prohibition, when thousands of American distilleries were forced to shut down. Others were abandoned for decades before passionate distillers revived them from near extinction. And some modern distilleries started as tiny experimental projects in warehouses and garages before becoming respected names in the industry. When you drink a spirit without knowing that background, it's easy to treat the bottle like just another product on the shelf. But once you understand the journey behind it, the people who built the distillery, the risks they took, the years spent aging barrels in warehouses, something changes. Suddenly, the liquid in your glass isn't just whiskey, rum, or bourbon. It becomes a piece of history you can taste. And that deeper connection is what separates casual drinking from true appreciation of craft spirits. Take a look at some classic scout spirits that reward curiosity. One example is Michter's. Today it's known for premium American whiskey, but its roots trace back to one of the earliest distilleries in the United States, originally founded in Pennsylvania in the 1700s. The distillery shut down in the late 1980s and its equipment was sold off. For years, many thought the brand was gone forever. But decades later, the name was revived and carefully rebuilt, creating a new chapter that connects modern whiskey lovers with an incredibly deep American distilling tradition. Another interesting example is Balcones Distilling in Texas. Instead of copying traditional Scotch or Kentucky bourbon styles, the distillery experimented with local grains and unconventional aging conditions. The result? Bold flavors that reflect Texas climate and creativity. These kinds of distilleries remind us that great spirits don't always come from the biggest producers. Sometimes the most exciting bottles come from producers willing to experiment, rebuild, or reinvent themselves. And once you know that background, each sip feels more intentional. But sometimes the story behind a spirit becomes truly emotional. Consider Pinhook Bourbon. Instead of trying to make every release taste exactly the same, Pinhook intentionally produces different vintages each year, similar to how wine evolves. That means every batch reflects the specific conditions of that moment in time, the grains, the barrels, and the decisions made during that year. What makes the story fascinating is their long-term vision. They purchased thousands of barrels and committed to tracking how those barrels develop over many years, allowing drinkers to experience the natural evolution of the whiskey. In other words, you aren't just drinking a finished product, you're tasting a journey that's still unfolding. When you realize that a bottle represents years of patience, experimentation, and risk, the experience becomes more than just drinking alcohol. It becomes a connection to craft, history, and people who dedicated their lives to creating something meaningful. And that's when a scout spirit stops feeling like a random bottle and starts feeling like a story worth discovering. Once you begin learning the history behind distilleries, your entire relationship with spirits changes. You stop chasing hype. You start searching for stories. And those stories often lead you to the most interesting bottles you've never heard of. Because sometimes the best spirits aren't the most famous ones. They're the ones with the most fascinating journey behind them. Now, I'm curious, what's a hidden gem spirit you've discovered that had an incredible distillery story behind it? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to see what bottles you've found. And if you enjoy exploring the deeper stories behind great spirits, make sure to subscribe for more honest conversations about whiskey, bourbon, and the craft behind the glass.